In February 1942, a young American ranger named Leland Young stepped off the train at Speenbridge Station in the Scottish Highlands, hefted his 36-pound Bergen onto his back, chambered a round in his rifle, and began a 7-mile forced march to Achnacarry Castle. He had precisely 60 minutes to complete the march. Failure meant immediate RTU, return to unit, and the end of his commando career before it began. What made this moment extraordinary wasn't the punishing distance or the weight. It was that live ammunition cracked overhead as he marched. Training officers fired Bren guns 6 inches above the trainees' heads to simulate combat conditions. By 1946, when the last course graduated, more than 25,000 men had made this march. Some hadn't survived it. On paper, this shouldn't have worked. Traditional military theory held that elite forces required purpose-built facilities, controlled ranges with measured distances, climate-regulated barracks, and graduated training programs that minimized risk. The Germans trained their Fallschirmjäger at Stendel's state-of-the-art facilities with precision equipment. The Waffen-SS selected their men at dedicated training schools like Bad Tölz, where every variable could be controlled. Standard military thinking emphasized safety margins, progressive difficulty, and the preservation of expensive training infrastructure. Yet Britain requisitioned drafty Victorian shooting lodges scattered across some of the wettest, coldest, most inaccessible terrain in Europe, and produced the finest special forces of the war. The paradox deepened further. These training grounds operated for 4 years in near total secrecy, yet sat barely 100 miles from major population centres. German intelligence knew British commandos existed. They'd captured enough of them to understand their capabilities. What the Abwehr never discovered, despite their extensive network of informants, was precisely where these men were trained, or how many training schools operated simultaneously. This wasn't accidental. The Highlands' apparent disadvantages, remoteness, harsh weather, primitive facilities, were precisely what made the system impossible for German intelligence to penetrate. Military planners in 1940 faced an unprecedented challenge. Winston Churchill had ordered the creation of special forces to set Europe ablaze through sabotage and irregular warfare. The Special Operations Executive needed to train agents who could operate behind enemy lines. The Commandos required soldiers capable of amphibious raids. Both organisations needed absolute secrecy. Standard military installations wouldn't do. Purpose-built facilities would take years to construct and would be obvious targets for Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights. On paper, the solution seemed obvious: requisition existing facilities in secure areas with good transport links, close to established military infrastructure. Critics argued that remote Scottish locations would create logistical nightmares. How would you supply 10 separate training schools scattered across terrain without proper roads? Standard military thinking emphasized accessibility and efficiency. The reality of operational security showed something different. In May 1940, SOE requisitioned Arisaig House and 9 surrounding shooting lodges in the Morar Peninsula, approximately 150 miles northwest of Glasgow. The strategic protected area covered roughly 2,000 square miles of the wildest terrain in Britain. Access required either a single-track road through Fort William or the West Highland Railway line, both easily monitored. In December 1941, Achnacarry Castle became the Commando Basic Training Centre under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan's command. What made this work wasn't just remoteness. The British government restricted access to much of Lochaber by preventing non-residents from crossing the Caledonian Canal. The canal, completed in 1822, bisected the Great Glen and created a natural choke point. Anyone attempting to reach the training areas from the east had to cross at monitored points. From the west, the Atlantic coastline offered no practical approach. The nearest harbours were fishing villages where strangers would be immediately noticed. Ben Nevis, Britain's highest mountain at 1,345 metres, dominated the southern approaches. The Morar Peninsula's single-track road wound through narrow glens where vehicle movement could be observed for miles. This seemed like an operational disadvantage. To SOE planners in London, it meant endless complications, delayed communication, difficult supply lines, the challenge of moving foreign nationals to isolated locations whilst maintaining cover stories. Yet to the men training there, and to the security services responsible for protecting them, the Highlands' isolation was perfect. The very difficulty of access that made logistics complex also made German infiltration impossible. Standard intelligence doctrine in 1940 held that identifying military training facilities required three elements: concentrated troop movements, distinctive infrastructure, and observable training activities. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed British military bases regularly. The Abwehr maintained informant networks that reported unusual activity. What they encountered in the Highlands defeated both approaches. SOE designated its Highland training schools by number, creating a deliberate maze of facilities. STS-21, Arisaig House, served as headquarters for Grouper paramilitary training. STS-22, Rubana Lodge, sat on a peninsula jutting into Loch Morar, accessible only by boat or a 3-mile track. STS-23, Yeovil Lodge, occupied the eastern shore of Loch Morar. 10 separate facilities in total, none closer than 2 miles to its neighbour, each occupying an existing sporting lodge that from the air appeared identical to dozens of other Highland estates. On paper, this dispersion was madness. Centralised training maximises efficiency through shared resources, standardised instruction, and economy of scale. The Germans understood this. Their training establishments concentrated expertise at locations you could identify on a map, photograph from aircraft, and deduce their purpose from observable patterns. Critics in the British military argued the Highland system wasted instructors through duplication. Yet in reality, this dispersion made the network invisible. 10 lodges scattered across 2,000 square miles generated no distinctive signature. Troop movements arrived by train at Speen Bridge in groups of 30 to 40 men, indistinguishable from normal military transit. Each lodge accommodated 25 to 40 trainees, small enough that smoke from chimneys or vehicles on tracks appeared entirely consistent with a working Highland estate. When German reconnaissance flights photographed the area, they saw exactly what British planners wanted: empty wilderness punctuated by sporting lodges that had existed for decades. The training schedule reinforced this invisibility. Courses ran for 3 weeks initially, extended to 5 by 1943. Different nationalities trained at different lodges: French agents at Garramore, Czech operatives at Tray House, Norwegians at Drummontool Lodge. This separation served security. Agents who didn't know each other's identities couldn't compromise operations if captured, but it also fragmented the signature. A German agent who somehow identified one lodge's purpose would learn nothing about the others. What actually mattered was that the Highlands enforced security through geography rather than guards. You cannot surveil a facility you cannot approach. The remoteness that looked like a liability was deliberate asymmetric defence. German intelligence identified the general area. Captured commandos admitted they'd trained in Scotland, but never located specific facilities. Military training doctrine in 1942 emphasised graduated progression: master basics with dummy ammunition, advance to controlled live fire on measured ranges, then apply skills in field exercises with strict safety protocols. American forces trained at purpose-built facilities like Fort Benning, where ranges were surveyed to the inch and safety officers enforced rigid protocols. Standard military thinking held that using live ammunition in uncontrolled environments was reckless. Achnacarry Castle operated differently. The Commando Basic Training Centre compressed what conventional armies taught in 6 months into 6 weeks. The course began with that 7-mile speed march, 60 minutes with 36 pounds of kit and a loaded rifle. Those who succeeded found themselves in a regime that would have horrified safety officers anywhere else in the British military. Instructors fired live rounds 6 inches above trainees' heads during assault courses. Demolition training used real explosives. The culminating exercise, an opposed landing at Bunnakeag on Loch Lochy, pitted trainees against instructors using live ammunition. As trainee Daniel Holdsworth recalled, "The Americans were not happy with the exercise and wouldn't do it again. I couldn't see what they were complaining about since no one was killed. On paper, this approach was indefensible. Training casualties at Achnacarry occurred. Veterans acknowledged deaths. Critics argued that controlled progression achieved the same results with fewer losses. The Germans, despite their doctrine of hardship training, didn't fire live rounds during basic instruction. Why would Britain risk men who'd volunteered for the most dangerous service? Yet in reality, those who graduated Achnacarry demonstrated capabilities that conventionally trained soldiers couldn't match. The secret was in understanding what combat actually demanded. Battlefields aren't measured ranges with marked distances and predictable threats. The first moments of contact are chaos. The sound of incoming rounds, the shock of violence, the instant when training either takes over or fails. Men who'd never experienced fire under training froze when first shot at in combat. Achnacarry graduates had heard rounds crack past their heads dozens of times. When enemy fire erupted around them in France or Italy or Burma, their bodies remembered, "This is survivable, keep moving." The training wasn't about callousness, it was about calibration. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Vaughan understood that conventional safety margins created false confidence. The Highlands provided something no purpose-built facility could: uncontrolled terrain where every exercise approximated actual combat. Trainees navigated rivers swollen with Highland rain, not concrete water obstacles. They climbed actual mountains in snow, not training towers. What proved this approach worked was the performance of Achnacarry graduates in combat. At Dieppe in August 1942, Commandos from No. 3 and No. 4 units successfully silenced German guns at Berneval and Varengeville, whilst Canadian forces suffered catastrophic casualties on the main beaches. German after-action reports described the Commandos' uncanny calm. At Tourmaline in October 1943, No. 2 Commando secured the port and held it for 3 days against German counterattacks that outnumbered them 5-1. Traditional military instruction in 1940 followed hierarchical patterns. Drill sergeants taught parade ground discipline, range officers supervised marksmanship. Expertise was segmented and formalised. The system produced competent soldiers through structured progression. Critics of irregular warfare argue that special forces couldn't be mass-produced. Yet SOE and the Commandos recruited instructors from profoundly unusual backgrounds. William Fairbairn and Eric Sykes had served in the Shanghai Municipal Police during the 1920s and 30s, when Shanghai was the most violent city in the world. Fairbairn personally survived dozens of street fights. He and Sykes developed close-quarters combat techniques not from theory, but from surviving encounters where hesitation meant death. Their training at Arisaig covered what they called silent killing, methods for neutralising sentries without alerting guards. On paper, Fairbairn and Sykes seemed like questionable choices. Neither held senior military rank. Their methods weren't in any manual. Standard military thinking emphasised formal martial arts training as the foundation for hand-to-hand combat. Critics argued that street fighting techniques didn't belong in military training. The reality of covert operations revealed something different. SOE agents operating in occupied France needed to kill quietly when discovered. Commandos raiding German positions had to eliminate sentries without raising alarms. Fairbairn and Sykes understood violence in ways martial arts instructors didn't. When Fairbairn demonstrated how to break a sentry's neck, trainees watched a man who'd done exactly that. The Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife embodied this philosophy. The 7-inch double-edged blade wasn't a utility tool, it was an assassination weapon. The needle-pointed tip could punch through ribs. Manufactured by Wilkinson Sword, over 250,000 were produced during the war. German forces recognised it immediately as evidence of commando identity. What made this work wasn't any single technique, but the instructor's understanding of chaos. Fairbairn knew that stressed men revert to instinct. His system taught techniques that worked when performed incorrectly, in darkness, whilst injured or exhausted. When SOE agents Jan Kubisch and Josef Gabčík assassinated Reinhard Heydrich in Prague on 27 May 1942, they trained at Garamore. The operation succeeded despite Gabčík's Sten gun jamming because training had prepared them to continue through equipment failure. German military training in 1942 emphasised controlled conditions. Exercises occurred during appropriate seasons. This approach reflected sound resource management. Why risk men and equipment to weather when you could achieve training objectives in controlled settings? Critics of Highland training argued that exposing men to Scotland's notorious climate served no purpose beyond building character. The Scottish Highlands in winter are genuinely brutal. Average temperatures hover around 2 degrees Celsius, but wind chill regularly drops effective temperatures below freezing. Rainfall exceeds 2,000 millimetres annually in the Western Highlands. The wind blows horizontally, driving rain through every gap in clothing. Loch Morar's water temperature stays around 4 degrees Celsius year-round. On paper, this was simply miserable. Equipment corroded faster, maintenance requirements increased. Standard military thinking held that soldiers trained in reasonable conditions would adapt to field conditions when necessary. Why make training harder than combat needed to be? Yet in reality, the weather became the training. When Norwegian Commandos returned to attack the Norsk hydro heavy water plant at Vemork in February 1943, they operated in temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius. The mission succeeded partly because the men had spent months training in Scottish winter conditions. They'd learned to maintain weapons in freezing rain and maintain operational effectiveness whilst constantly cold and wet. The secret was in building physiological adaptation. Men who'd spent 6 weeks in Highland weather developed cold tolerance. They learned to regulate body temperature through movement rather than depending on external heating. Most importantly, they'd experienced true misery and continued functioning through it. Highland training also enforced equipment familiarity under worst-case conditions. A weapon that functions on a dry range might jam when rain-soaked. At the Highland training schools, everything failed regularly, and students learned to maintain functionality despite failures. What proved this approach worked was the testimony of those deployed. US Army Ranger Leylin Young wrote home, "The English Channel feels warm after Loch Morar. The weather that seemed like a liability became the forge that turned ordinary soldiers into men who wouldn't quit regardless of conditions." Between 1942 and 1946, more than 25,000 men graduated from Achnacarry. Thousands more trained at the 10 SOE schools. They came from Britain, the United States, France, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Czechoslovakia and Poland. They departed for raids across occupied Europe, resistance liaison in France, demolition operations in Norway, and jungle warfare in Burma. When the war ended, several nations attempted to replicate the British model. The Americans formed the Special Forces based on OSS and Ranger experiences. Many founding officers had trained in Scotland. The French created parachute commando units led by Jedburgh veterans who'd passed through Highland training. Yet none precisely duplicated the Highland system. The physical training schools closed in 1946. Achnacarry returned to the Cameron clan. The SOE lodges reverted to private ownership. Many now operate as luxury holiday lets. The Commando Memorial, unveiled by the Queen Mother in 1952, overlooks the training grounds. What persists is the principle that extreme conditions reveal capability. The Highlands didn't make men brave. They selected those who could function through fear. Modern special forces still train in mountains, still conduct cold weather operations, still use realistic scenarios. But none train with quite the ruthlessness of those Highland schools. The Germans never found the training schools because they weren't where conventional intelligence expected them. They weren't fortified complexes with obvious security. They were Victorian shooting lodges in terrain so remote that access itself provided security. They operated for 4 years, trained tens of thousands, and contributed decisively to Allied victory, whilst remaining invisible. This wasn't luck. It was strategic geography turned into a symmetric advantage, weather weaponized as training tool, and British understanding that sometimes the harshest environment is the perfect classroom. The Highlands didn't hide the training schools. The Highlands were the training schools, and that made all the difference.